On a cold night in 1995, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Pennsylvania, a 5-year-old girl vanished in the middle of the night, and investigators had no answers. Nearly a decade later, a single discovery changed everything, and it exposed a dark secret no one was prepared for. The town of Doylestown, Pennsylvania, is the kind of picturesque, historic community where families settle down to find peace and quiet. In the mid-1990s, it was a place defined by its tight-knit neighborhoods, tall oak trees, and a sense of absolute security. For 28-year-old Sophia and her husband, Robert, it was supposed to be the perfect place to raise their only child, a bright, deeply imaginative 5-year-old girl named Emma. Sophia was a dedicated, incredibly hardworking emergency room nurse at the local county hospital. She possessed a natural warmth and a fierce, protective maternal instinct that made her an exceptional caregiver. Despite the exhausting, grueling hours of her job, Sophia's entire world revolved entirely around her daughter. Emma was a joyful, radiant little girl with a head full of blonde curls and a missing front tooth. She was obsessed with fairy tales, castles, and princesses. She spent hours sitting at the kitchen table with her crayons, drawing elaborate, colorful kingdoms. Sophia kept every single drawing, tapping them proudly to the front of their refrigerator. Robert, on the other hand, was a man completely defined by control and precision. He was a highly successful, independent architectural draftsman and custom home contractor. Robert had actually built their beautiful, 2-story colonial house from the ground up. He knew every single piece of timber, every pipe, and every electrical wire inside the walls. He was a meticulous, deeply organized man who demanded perfection in every aspect of his life. But behind the closed doors of their custom-built home, the marriage was quietly, irreparably crumbling. Robert's need for absolute perfection had slowly transformed into a suffocating, deeply oppressive need for control. He dictated Sophia's schedule, tracked her finances, and isolated her from her friends. After years of walking on eggshells to avoid his quiet, simmering anger, Sophia had finally reached her breaking point. Just 1 month before that cold November night, Sophia had sat Robert down at the kitchen table and told him she wanted a legal separation. Sophia had braced herself for a massive, volatile argument, but Robert's reaction was entirely unexpected. He didn't yell, and he didn't throw things. He simply stared at her with cold, empty eyes and agreed. He told her that he would move out after the holidays, but he asked to remain in the house for a few more weeks so he could finish some foundational repairs in the basement to prepare the property for sale. Sophia, wanting to keep the peace for Emma's sake, agreed to the arrangement. She noticed that Robert began spending hours down in the basement, the sound of power tools and heavy hammers echoing through the floorboards late into the night. She assumed he was simply distracting himself with his construction work. She had absolutely no idea he was actually building a nightmare. Tuesday, November 14, 1995, brought a bitter, freezing wind through the streets of Doylestown. The autumn leaves were entirely gone, leaving the trees looking bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Sophia was scheduled to work a grueling 12-hour overnight shift in the emergency room. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Sophia stood in the warm, brightly lit kitchen, helping Emma put on her favorite pink fleece pajamas. Emma was giggling, wrapping her small arms tightly around her mother's neck. Sophia carried her upstairs to her bedroom, which Robert had painted a soft, beautiful shade of lavender. Sophia tucked Emma into her small bed, pulling a heavy, quilted blanket up to her chin to protect her from the winter draft. Sophia sat on the edge of the mattress and read Emma a story about a brave princess who lived in a hidden castle. When the story was over, Emma's eyes were already growing heavy. Sophia kissed her daughter softly on the forehead, whispering that she loved her more than anything in the entire universe. "I love you too, Mommy," Emma mumbled, her small fingers clutching the edge of her pink blanket. Sophia walked out into the hallway, leaving the bedroom door cracked open just a few inches so the light from the hall would cast a comforting glow into the room. Robert was standing at the bottom of the stairs, wiping dust off his hands with a heavy canvas rag. He had just come up from the basement. He looked at Sophia, his expression completely blank, and told her to have a good shift. He promised he would check on Emma in a few hours. Sophia grabbed her heavy winter coat, walked out the front door, and drove into the freezing, dark night, completely unaware that her entire life was about to be destroyed. The emergency room was chaotic that night, keeping Sophia on her feet for 12 exhausting hours. She didn't have a single moment to sit down or call the house. When her shift finally ended at 6:30 the next morning, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, cold light over the frosty Pennsylvania roads. Sophia was physically and emotionally drained, completely running on empty as she drove her small sedan back into her quiet neighborhood. When Sophia pulled into her driveway at exactly 7 in the morning, the house looked perfectly normal. The morning frost clung to the roof, and the front porch light was still on. She unlocked the front door, taking off her heavy coat and hanging her keys on the hook in the entryway. The house was completely, entirely silent. Sophia walked into the kitchen expecting to find Robert making coffee or reading the morning newspaper, but the kitchen was empty. She walked into the living room. It was empty as well. A sudden, deep chill ran down her spine. It was a school morning. Emma usually woke up at 6:30, bursting with energy, demanding a bowl of cereal. The profound, heavy silence of the house felt deeply wrong. Sophia walked quickly to the bottom of the wooden staircase. She called out Emma's name, her voice echoing into the quiet second floor. There was no answer. She hurried up the stairs, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She pushed Emma's bedroom door fully open, expecting to see her little girl deeply asleep, tangled in her pink blankets. But the bed was entirely empty. The heavy, quilted blanket was pulled back. Emma's favorite stuffed animals were sitting neatly against the pillows, but Emma was not there. Sophia immediately noticed how incredibly cold the bedroom was. The temperature was freezing, completely unnatural for the second floor of a well-heated house. She turned her head toward the far wall of the bedroom. The heavy, wooden frame of the bedroom window was pushed wide open. The metal screen that usually covered the glass had been violently popped out of its frame, resting haphazardly on the frosty roof of the front porch just below the window. A bitter, freezing gust of November wind was blowing aggressively into the room, billowing the lavender curtains. A wave of pure, absolute terror crashed over Sophia. She ran to the open window, leaning out over the sill, looking down at the frosty grass of the front yard. There was no sign of her daughter. "Emma!" Sophia screamed, her voice tearing with raw, primal panic. She turned around and sprinted down the hallway, bursting into the master bedroom. Robert was sitting on the edge of the bed, wearing a white undershirt and dark sweatpants. He looked up, his eyes wide and confused, acting exactly as if he had just been woken up by her screaming. "She's gone," Sophia sobbed hysterically, grabbing Robert's shoulders and violently shaking him. "The window is open. Emma is gone." Robert immediately jumped to his feet, his face turning incredibly pale. He sprinted down the hallway into Emma's room, staring at the open window and the empty bed. He let out a loud, devastated shout, grabbing the cordless phone from the hallway and immediately dialing 911. Sophia collapsed onto the floor of the hallway, pulling her knees to her chest, hyperventilating as the impossible, horrifying reality crushed the air completely out of her lungs. Her beautiful, 5-year-old daughter had been taken in the middle of the night, directly from her own bed. Within 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of half a dozen Doylestown police cruisers flooded the quiet residential street. Neighbors stepped out onto their front porches, pulling their heavy robes tight, watching in absolute shock as heavily armed officers swarmed the beautiful colonial home. The lead investigator assigned to the scene was Detective David Miller. Miller was a veteran of the local police force, a sharp, deeply methodical man who had worked missing children cases before. He knew that the first 48 hours of a child abduction were absolutely critical. When he walked through the front door, the sheer emotional devastation of the scene was overwhelming. Sophia was sitting on the living room sofa, completely inconsolable, weeping so heavily she could barely breathe. Robert was packing back and forth in the kitchen, his hands pulling frantically at his hair, recounting exactly what he had done the night before to a uniformed officer. Robert claimed that he had watched television until 11 o'clock, checked on Emma, saw that she was fast asleep, and then went to bed himself. He swore he had heard absolutely nothing during the night. He stated he was a heavy sleeper, and because the wind was howling outside, any noise from the window must have been entirely masked by the weather. He played the role of a devastated, terrified father with absolute, flawless perfection. Detective Miller walked upstairs, stepping carefully into the freezing lavender bedroom. A team of forensic technicians was already dusting the wooden windowsill and the heavy glass frame for fingerprints. Miller approached the open window, pulling his heavy coat tight against the bitter draft. The scene perfectly suggested an external abduction. The predator had allegedly climbed onto the roof of the front porch, pried the metal screen loose, opened the unlocked window, and reached into the room to take the sleeping child. It was a terrifying narrative that deeply frightened every parent on the police force. But as Detective Miller leaned closely over the wooden windowsill, carefully examining the dust and the frost, a deep, unsettling feeling began to gnaw at the back of his mind. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Miller asked the forensic technician for a small flashlight. He shined the bright white beam directly onto the wooden track of the window frame. The house was newly built, and the windows were heavy, modern, double-paned glass. They required a significant amount of physical strength to push upward. If someone had climbed onto the icy roof of the porch in the middle of a freezing night, balanced on the slippery shingles, and forced the heavy window open from the outside, they would have had to push their hands aggressively against the glass and the wooden frame. They would have dragged muddy shoes over the sill. But the wooden sill was entirely clean. The thick layer of household dust resting on the exterior metal track of the window was completely undisturbed. There were absolutely no scuff marks on the white paint. There were no muddy footprints on the frosty shingles of the porch roof directly below the window. The window had not been forced open from the outside. Detective Miller stood up, turning his head to look at the empty pink bed, and then turning back to look at the open window. The terrible, impossible truth of the physical evidence whispered a terrifying secret. The predator had not climbed into the house to take the child. The window had been deliberately, carefully opened from the inside of the bedroom. The meticulous preservation of the dust on the outside of the window track sent a sharp jolt of suspicion through Detective David Miller. He stood in the center of the freezing lavender bedroom, watching the forensic technicians quietly pack up their fingerprint brushes. If the window had been opened from the inside, it meant the entire abduction scenario was a calculated performance. The open window was a decoy, a clumsy attempt to direct the focus of the investigation outward, into the vast expanses of the surrounding woods and the county highway. Detective Miller walked slowly down the stairs and into the basement. He found Robert sitting on a wooden step, his head buried in his hands. The large space was cluttered with standard construction materials, stacks of drywall, heavy bags of concrete, and buckets of white paint. The air smelled strongly of fresh sawdust and chemical sealant. Robert looked up, his face an immaculate mask of grief and confusion. He asked Miller if they had found any footprints in the yard, his voice trembling as he pleaded for any update about his little girl. Miller observed the man carefully, keeping his voice flat and professional. He asked Robert why he had been spending so many hours in the basement over the past few weeks. Robert sighed heavily, explaining that because of the impending separation, He wanted to finish repairing the foundational cinder blocks to maximize the home's resale value before he officially moved out. He reached into a leather tool belt resting on the floor and pulled out a rolled-up, professional architectural blueprint. He handed it to the detective. "I designed this house myself, Detective," Robert said, his hands shaking slightly as he unrolled the heavy paper. "I know every structural support. If someone broke in, they had to have used the front porch roof. Here is the layout of the foundation and the upper rooms. You can see how accessible that window is from the outside." Miller took the blueprints, studying the clean, precise lines drawn in blue ink. The document showed a perfectly standard colonial layout, a two-story structure with a standard, shallow four-corner concrete crawl space beneath the main floorboards. There were no hidden alcoves, no irregular wall structures, and no structural gaps. It was a flawless piece of drafting. The blueprint completely validated Robert's explanation, presenting a home with absolutely nowhere to hide a child. Miller thanked him, tucked the heavy paper under his arm, and walked back up to the living room. The initial phase of the police efforts was a massive, exhausting operation. The local authorities, refusing to ignore any possibility, organized a wide-sweeping ground search of the entire Doylestown area. Over 200 local volunteers, state troopers, and search and rescue teams marched shoulder to shoulder through the freezing autumn woods. They dragged the cold, murky bottom of the nearby Neshaminy Creek, checked every abandoned barn in the county, and knocked on the door of every single home in the residential neighborhood. Sophia's family and friends arrived from across the state to support her. Her mother sat with her on the living room sofa, holding a cold washcloth to her forehead while Sophia wept continuously. Sophia refused to sleep, staring blankly at the front door, waiting for her phone to ring with a ransom demand or a tip from a stranger. She was caught in the suffocating trap of an absolute living nightmare. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Her bright, beautiful 5-year-old girl was entirely gone, and the police were finding absolutely zero physical evidence to explain where she had been taken. As the weeks bled into months, the intense public scrutiny began to take a severe toll on Robert. Despite his perfect performance as a grieving father, Detective Miller kept his focus directly on him. The lack of forced entry and the pristine window sill pointed heavily toward an insider. Miller brought Robert into the precinct for multiple polygraph tests. Robert passed every single one of them with flying colors, his heart rate and breathing remaining completely steady under the intense pressure. He was a man of absolute, chilling discipline. Robert utilized the media to his advantage, standing on the front lawn in front of television cameras, holding up Emma's favorite drawings of fairy tale castles. He publicly blamed the police for focusing on him instead of tracking down the phantom predator who had climbed onto his roof. The public pressure shifted, and the department faced severe criticism for harassing a grieving father. Without a body, without a confession, and with an airtight blueprint showing a completely normal house, the district attorney flatly refused to file any charges. The investigation slowly hit a massive, unyielding brick wall. By the spring of 1996, the initial command center was officially dismantled. The missing person posters taped to the storefronts began to fade and tear in the rain. Sophia, unable to bear the suffocating memories of the custom-built house, officially finalized the divorce and moved into a small apartment near the hospital, throwing herself into her nursing shifts to numb the agonizing pain. Robert remained in the colonial home alone, maintaining the property with meticulous care. He lived a quiet, reclusive life, rarely speaking to his neighbors, completely blending into the background of the quiet community. 6 long, agonizing years passed. The world moved forward into the year 2001. Emma was officially listed as a cold case file, resting in a heavy metal drawer at the precinct. Sophia had aged significantly, the lines of deep, permanent grief permanently etched around her eyes. She still visited the local police station every single month, begging Detective Miller for any update, but the file remained completely silent. Then, on an ordinary morning in October of 2001, a small-town utility crew arrived in the residential neighborhood to upgrade the main underground sewage and water lines. The work required digging deep trenches into the gravel and asphalt lines directly parallel to Robert's property. The crew was operating a massive, heavy hydraulic excavator, tearing up deep layers of earth and stone that had sat undisturbed for nearly a decade. The heavy steel bucket of the excavator drove aggressively into the dirt near the edge of Robert's driveway. As the operator pulled the lever to lift the heavy load, a loud, sharp metallic screech echoed through the quiet street. The machine had struck something incredibly solid and metallic deep beneath the soil. The foreman stopped the machine, grabbing a hand shovel to manually clear away the thick, wet clay. About 4 feet below the surface, his shovel scraped against a large, rusted industrial iron pipe. It was a heavy-duty ventilation conduit, completely out of place for a residential property. The foreman knelt down, wiping the mud away from a small metal grate attached to the end of the pipe. He shined his flashlight into the dark opening, expecting to see a clogged sewer line. But as he listened closely to the dark mouth of the iron pipe, a sudden, terrifying chill ran down his spine. Coming from deep within the earth, traveling through the metal tube from the direction of the house's foundation, was a faint, muffled sound. It was the distinct, rhythmic sound of a child softly humming a nursery rhyme. The utility foreman completely froze. He dropped his heavy hand shovel into the wet mud, his heart suddenly pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribcage. He knelt down in the deep trench, ignoring the freezing water soaking through the knees of his denim work pants, and pressed his ear directly against the cold, rusted metal grate of the iron pipe. It was faint, distorted by the long echo of the hollow metal tube, but it was absolutely undeniable. It was the soft, melodic, gentle humming of a child singing a nursery rhyme. The foreman stumbled backward in the trench, his face turning completely pale. He frantically waved for his coworkers to shut off the heavy hydraulic excavator. The massive, roaring engine died, leaving the quiet suburban street in total silence. The foreman ordered another worker to climb down into the dirt and listen to the pipe. When the second man pressed his ear to the metal, his eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. They didn't touch the pipe again. They immediately climbed out of the trench and called the police. Detective David Miller was sitting at his desk at the Doylestown precinct when the dispatch call came through. He was an older man now, his hair heavily grayed from the stress of a career filled with tragedies, but he had never let the ghost of Emma's disappearance fade from his mind. Her smiling face was still pinned to the corkboard directly above his telephone. When the dispatcher told him that a utility crew had found a hidden pipe near the property line of the cold case house, Miller grabbed his coat and ran out of the building. When Miller arrived at the quiet residential street, he found the utility crew standing far away from the trench, smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. Miller climbed down into the muddy ditch. He knelt in the wet dirt, leaned forward, and placed his ear against the cold iron grate. For a long, agonizing minute, there was absolutely nothing but the sound of the wind blowing through the autumn trees. Miller held his breath, desperately praying. And then he heard it, a quiet, soft, rhythmic humming drifting up from the absolute darkness of the earth. A massive, electrifying wave of pure adrenaline shot completely through the veteran detective. He stumbled out of the trench, his hands violently shaking as he grabbed his police radio. He requested a specialized, heavy structural engineering team from the city to report to the scene immediately. He completely locked down the entire street, establishing a hard perimeter to ensure absolutely no one could approach the house. When the city engineers arrived, they carefully examined the heavy iron pipe without disturbing the surrounding soil. The head engineer climbed out of the trench and walked over to Detective Miller, his face grave and deeply troubled. The engineer explained that the pipe was absolutely not a standard city sewer line, and it was not a water main. It was a highly advanced, custom-installed, dual-flow ventilation intake tube. It was the exact type of industrial hardware used to supply fresh oxygen to deep underground bunkers or subterranean storm shelters. The pipe had been meticulously buried exactly parallel to the municipal water line to perfectly hide its existence from any standard ground surveys. And most terrifyingly, the heavy iron tube turned at a sharp 90-degree angle, running directly under the concrete foundation of Robert's custom-built house. Something felt wrong, really wrong. Miller sprinted back to his unmarked police cruiser and drove aggressively toward the precinct. He ran down into the heavily guarded basement archives, pulling the heavy metal drawer containing Emma's cold case file. He grabbed the thick, professional architectural blueprints that Robert had handed him 6 years ago. Miller spread the heavy blue paper across a large wooden table. He looked at the clean, precise lines showing the standard colonial layout, the normal basement, and the shallow concrete crawlspace. He then pulled out the official, city-mandated geographical-topographical survey for the exact same neighborhood, which he had requested on his drive over. Miller laid the city survey directly over Robert's custom blueprints. As he compared the two documents, the massive, horrifying brilliance of the predator's deception was finally, entirely exposed. Robert's house was built on a slight, natural incline in the land. The official city survey showed that the solid bedrock beneath his specific plot of land was a full 15 feet below the surface of the grass. But on the beautiful, clean blueprints Robert had drawn himself, he claimed he had poured the solid concrete foundation of the basement at only 8 feet deep. There was a massive, 7-foot vertical void sitting directly between the bottom of Robert's basement and the natural bedrock of the earth. It was a massive hollow space that was entirely unaccounted for on the official plans. Robert had deliberately forged the blueprints. He had completely fooled the county inspectors, he had fooled his wife, and he had flawlessly fooled the entire police department. He hadn't spent those late nights in the basement repairing cinder blocks for a separation sale. He had spent the entire month before the disappearance using heavy machinery to excavate the earth, pouring massive amounts of concrete to construct a heavily reinforced, completely secret subterranean room directly beneath the normal basement. The realization hit Detective Miller like a physical blow to the chest. Emma had never left the property. She hadn't been pulled through a freezing window by a phantom predator. Her own father had taken her from her warm bed, carried her downstairs, and locked her in a hidden, underground concrete vault. And he had kept her buried there for 6 agonizing years, while he casually drank his morning coffee in the kitchen just feet above her head. Miller did not wait for a standard court summons. He violently kicked open the door to the captain's office, slammed the conflicting blueprints onto the desk, and demanded an emergency, no-knock tactical search warrant from the county judge. Given the undeniable physical proof of the hidden ventilation pipe and the forged structural documents, the judge signed the warrant in a matter of minutes. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a massive, overwhelming convoy of heavily armored SWAT vehicles, blacked-out police cruisers, and forensic vans rolled silently down the quiet streets of Doylestown. They parked out of sight, entirely surrounding the beautiful colonial house. The heavily armed tactical team stacked up tightly on the front porch, their assault rifles raised, completely prepared for a violent confrontation. Detective Miller stood behind the lead breacher, his heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against his ribs. The breacher swung a heavy steel battering ram violently against the custom wooden front door. The loud, explosive crash shattered the heavy brass locks, sending the door flying inward, smashing aggressively against the drywall of the entryway. "Police, get on the ground!" the officers roared, flooding into the pristine living room, sweeping their bright tactical lights across the perfectly clean space. Robert was sitting in a comfortable leather armchair near the window, casually reading a hardcover book. He was now a man in his mid-30s, his hair slightly graying at the temples. When the door was blown open, he didn't jump. He didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't try to run. He simply placed a small bookmark between the pages, set the book gently on the small table next to him, and stood up with an expression of deep, arrogant indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" Robert demanded, his voice entirely calm, playing the role of the harassed, grieving father flawlessly. "You have absolutely no right to destroy my property." Two massive SWAT officers instantly lunged forward, grabbing Robert's arms and forcing him violently down onto the hardwood floor. They pulled his hands aggressively behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. Detective Miller walked slowly into the living room, stepping over the splintered wood of the broken front door. He walked directly up to the man lying on the floor, crouching down so they were perfectly at eye level. "We found the utility pipe, Robert," Miller said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper completely devoid of mercy. "We checked the bedrock survey. Your fake blueprints aren't going to save you anymore." For the very first time in 6 years, the flawless, arrogant mask of absolute control completely slipped from Robert's face. The color instantly drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking hollow, pale, and entirely terrified. He knew that the single, deeply buried flaw in his perfect fortress had finally been discovered. He squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to say a single word, knowing his reign of terror was officially over. With the suspect heavily secured and placed into the back of a police cruiser, the massive tactical search of the basement began. Miller and a highly specialized subterranean rescue team descended the wooden stairs into the large, open basement. The space was completely finished now. The concrete floor was perfectly smooth, painted with a clean gray epoxy. The walls were covered in neat white drywall. It looked exactly like an ordinary, well-maintained storage area. There were absolutely no visible trapdoors, no strange seams in the concrete, and no hidden keyholes. But Miller knew the truth was hidden directly beneath his boots. The tactical team brought in heavy, high-tech ground-penetrating radar equipment. They slowly pushed the heavy digital scanners back and forth across the smooth gray concrete floor. Suddenly, the digital monitor on the scanner lit up violently in bright red. The technician pointed to the screen, his hands shaking slightly. Directly beneath a large, open section of the concrete floor in the center of the room, the radar detected a massive, rectangular hollow cavity. It was exactly the size of a large bedroom, buried deep within the earth. "Tear it apart," Miller ordered, his voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. The tactical officers did not bother looking for a hidden button. They didn't have time to play a monster's twisted architectural games. They brought in heavy, industrial jackhammers and massive steel sledgehammers. The deafening, violent roar of the heavy machinery filled the basement. The officers drove the sharp steel bits directly into the center of the painted concrete floor. The thick gray stone violently cracked and splintered, sending massive clouds of thick, choking dust into the air. They worked with a frantic, feverish intensity, completely destroying the pristine floor Robert had spent weeks pouring. After 30 minutes of exhausting, backbreaking labor, one of the heavy jackhammers suddenly broke through the final layer of concrete, striking something incredibly solid and metallic beneath the stone. The officers quickly used heavy crowbars and their gloved hands to pull the shattered chunks of concrete away. Buried safely beneath the thick layer of poured stone, completely hidden from the world, was a massive, solid steel containment door. It was an industrial blast door, completely flush with the surrounding foundation. The door was secured by a heavy, complex hydraulic locking mechanism that had been wired into the main electrical grid of the house. Robert had designed a system that was completely impossible to open from the inside and entirely invisible from the outside, unless you knew exactly which walls to tear down. The officers quickly traced the heavy electrical wires running away from the steel door, following them up the wall toward the main electrical breaker box of the house. Miller opened the gray metal panel of the breaker box. Sitting innocently between the standard switches for the kitchen lights and the water heater was a small, unmarked heavy black switch. Miller took a deep, trembling breath, his heart racing. He reached out and violently pulled the heavy black switch downward. A loud, deep, mechanical groan instantly echoed beneath the floorboards. The heavy hydraulic pistons hidden within the foundation violently engaged. The massive, solid steel door resting in the floor slowly, heavily began to slide backward on a hidden metal track, grinding loudly against the stone. A rush of incredibly stale, freezing air blew up out of the dark hole, smelling of damp earth, heavy chemical cleaner and profound, total isolation. As the heavy steel door slid completely open, Detective Miller stepped forward, shining his bright tactical flashlight down into the abyss. Descending straight down into the absolute darkness of the earth was a narrow, steep staircase made of heavy, rusted iron grating. The staircase dropped a full 7 feet beneath the basement floor, leading directly into a pitch-black, silent subterranean vault. The heavy, suffocating silence of the basement was broken only by the deep, mechanical hum of the hydraulic pistons and the heavy breathing of the heavily armed tactical officers. Detective David Miller stood at the edge of the massive, open hole in the concrete floor, staring down into the absolute darkness of the earth. The narrow, steep staircase made of heavy, rusted iron grating descended directly into a pitch-black, hidden subterranean vault. Miller drew his service weapon, switched his tactical flashlight to its absolute brightest setting, and slowly placed his boot onto the first iron grate. The metal squeaked loudly under his weight, echoing down the dark shaft. The air rising from the hole was completely unnatural. It was freezing cold, smelling of stale dust, damp concrete, and the distinct, highly sterile scent of chemical cleaning supplies. The veteran detective slowly descended the iron stairs, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribcage. The SWAT team followed closely behind him, their assault rifles raised, sweeping their bright white weapons lights through the dark void. They climbed down a full 7 feet beneath the foundation of the house, stepping off the final iron rung onto a perfectly smooth, heavily painted concrete floor. Miller reached out his gloved hand and felt along the cold cinder-block wall. His fingers brushed against a standard plastic light switch. He took a deep, trembling breath and flipped the switch upward. A row of harsh, bright fluorescent lights flickered violently to life across the ceiling, completely illuminating the massive, hidden underground chamber. When the bright lights washed over the room, an absolute, paralyzing wave of sickening horror completely washed over Detective Miller and every single heavily armed officer standing behind him. Several of the massive, hardened SWAT officers actually lowered their weapons, completely unable to process the profound, twisted psychological nightmare they were looking at. It was not a dark, empty concrete prison cell. It was a macabre, deeply terrifying, flawless replica of a little girl's bedroom, built entirely inside a reinforced concrete vault. Robert had deliberately lined the freezing, solid cinder-block walls with thick, heavy-duty acoustic soundproofing foam to ensure that absolutely no sound could ever escape to the surface. But in a display of sickening, delusional control, he had painted the thick foam walls a soft, beautiful shade of lavender, perfectly matching the empty bedroom sitting 2 stories above them. Resting against the far wall was a small, white wooden bed covered in a heavy, pink quilted blanket. There was a small wooden desk covered in crayons, a large white bookshelf completely packed with fairy tale books, and dozens of stuffed animals sitting neatly on a soft, circular rug in the center of the concrete floor. Robert had not built a dungeon. In his deeply twisted, highly controlling mind, he had built a permanent, inescapable, secret kingdom where he could keep his daughter entirely to himself, completely safe from the world, and completely away from his ex-wife. Miller walked slowly into the center of the underground room, his boots stepping softly on the circular rug. He looked around the terrifying, lavender-painted vault, feeling a massive, crushing weight of emotional agony pressing against his chest. He walked over to a tall, white wooden dresser and slowly pulled the top drawer open. The drawer was completely filled with neatly folded clothing, but as Miller looked at the clothes, the heartbreaking, devastating reality of the passage of time completely shattered him. On the left side of the drawer were tiny, size 5 pink pajamas, exactly what Emma would have worn the night she vanished. But moving toward the right side of the drawer, the clothing progressively grew larger. There were size 7 jeans, size 9 sweaters, and finally, size 11 t-shirts. For 6 long, agonizing years, Robert had been quietly, meticulously providing for his captive daughter. He had been buying her larger clothes, bringing them down the secret stairs, and watching her grow up entirely inside a concrete box. He had continued to go to work, pay his taxes, smile at his neighbors, and play the role of the devastated, grieving father on local television, all while his daughter was trapped exactly 15 feet below his shoes. Miller turned his attention to the small wooden desk. It was completely covered in thousands of loose sheets of paper. He picked up a handful of the papers, holding them directly under the harsh fluorescent lights. They were Emma's drawings, but they were no longer the happy, colorful fairy tale castles she had drawn when she was 5 years old. The heartbreaking evolution of a captive child's mind was permanently documented in heavy, dark crayon. The older drawings showed a little girl with blonde curls crying heavy blue tears, surrounded by tall, black brick walls. But as the years progressed, the drawings became deeply disturbing. She began drawing a massive, towering dark shadow of a man standing over her. In every single recent drawing, the little girl had absolutely no mouth, a devastating, tragic psychological symbol of a child who realized that screaming would never, ever bring anyone to save her. And drawn heavily onto the painted acoustic foam behind the desk, completely covering the lavender walls, were thousands of tiny, desperate tally marks, proving that an incredibly smart little girl had been desperately trying to keep track of the days she had been stolen from the sun. Suddenly, a terrifying realization completely paralyzed Detective Miller. He looked at the small white bed. The pink quilted blanket was violently thrown back, heavily wrinkled and completely disorganized. He walked over and placed his bare hand directly onto the center of the mattress. The mattress was still warm. Emma was now 11 years old, and she had been sleeping in this exact bed just hours ago. But the massive, horrifying problem was staring Miller right in the face. The underground room was entirely, completely empty. Emma was nowhere to be found. Miller immediately grabbed his police radio, his voice echoing frantically in the subterranean vault, demanding to know Robert's exact status. The officers above ground confirmed that Robert was sitting silently in the back of the locked police cruiser in the driveway, refusing to speak to anyone. Miller's mind raced violently, putting the terrifying pieces of the puzzle together. At 10 o'clock that morning, the city utility crew had struck the heavy iron ventilation pipe with their massive hydraulic excavator. The screech of the metal bucket hitting the pipe would have vibrated violently through the earth, echoing loudly down into this exact room. Robert was sitting in his living room when it happened. Robert knew instantly that the utility crew had exposed his hidden oxygen line. He knew the police would eventually follow the pipe directly to his foundation. So, hours before Detective Miller ever requested the search warrant, Robert had climbed down into the hidden vault to initiate a terrifying, deeply desperate failsafe protocol. He had moved his daughter. "Search the walls," Miller roared at the tactical team, completely dropping his calm demeanor. "Tear this entire room apart. She is down here somewhere." The heavily armed SWAT officers instantly leaped into action. They began violently pulling the heavy bookshelves away from the lavender walls, throwing the thousands of fairy tale books onto the concrete floor. They flipped the small white bed completely upside down, checking the floorboards beneath the mattress. They used the heavy butts of their assault rifles to aggressively smash massive holes through the thick acoustic foam, desperately looking for any hidden seams in the cinderblock foundation. Miller joined the frantic search, his breath plumbing in the freezing air of the underground vault. He moved toward the very back corner of the room, approaching a massive, heavy wooden wardrobe painted with beautiful, elaborate white castles. The heavy piece of furniture looked exactly like it was permanently built directly into the concrete wall. But as Miller shined his bright tactical flashlight down at the smooth gray epoxy floor directly in front of the wardrobe, his blood ran completely cold. The perfectly painted gray concrete was covered in deep, heavy, completely fresh scuff marks. The heavy wooden wardrobe had been recently, violently dragged across the floor. Miller immediately called for two massive tactical officers. They rushed over, dropping their weapons to their sides. They grabbed the heavy, decorative wooden edges of the castle wardrobe, planted their heavy tactical boots firmly on the concrete floor, and pulled backward with absolutely every ounce of their combined physical strength. With a loud, protesting screech of heavy wood dragging against concrete, the massive wardrobe slowly slid away from the corner of the room. When the heavy furniture was completely moved out of the way, the brilliant, terrifying, and deeply psychotic depth of Robert's architectural paranoia was fully, entirely exposed. Hidden completely behind the wardrobe, set deeply into the solid cinderblock foundation, was a second, massive, heavily reinforced steel vault door. Robert had not just built a hidden room. He had used his professional contracting skills to construct a secondary, heavily armored panic room hidden entirely within the first bunker. It was a terrifying, windowless steel box designed exactly for this horrifying scenario. The secondary vault door did not have a handle, and it did not have a hydraulic switch. Set directly into the center of the heavy, cold steel plate was a complex, heavy-duty mechanical combination dial, exactly like the kind used to secure massive commercial bank safes. Miller stepped forward, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the heavy steel dial. Without the specific, multi-digit combination code, the door was absolutely, completely impenetrable. It would take a specialized commercial safe-cracking team hours, if not days, to drill through the dense layers of steel and tungsten. But the door was entirely flush with the concrete frame. It was an airtight, perfectly sealed environmental vault. If Robert had locked an 11-year-old girl inside that tiny, unventilated steel box hours ago to hide her from the police, she was currently trapped in absolute pitch-black darkness with a rapidly, dangerously diminishing supply of breathable oxygen. Miller pressed his hands flat against the freezing, heavy steel door, desperate to find any way to pry it open. He rested his ear directly against the cold metal plate, closing his eyes, entirely blocking out the chaotic noise of the heavily armed officers searching the room behind him. The silence inside the vault was incredibly heavy, pressing against his eardrums like a physical weight. He held his breath, praying for an absolute miracle. And then, coming from the absolute pitch-black darkness on the other side of the impenetrable steel door, completely muffled by the heavy armor but undeniably real, Detective Miller heard it. It was a quiet, desperate, rhythmic tapping against the heavy metal wall, followed immediately by the faint, terrified, heartbreaking sound of a young girl crying for her mother. The faint, desperate tapping against the heavy steel plate and the quiet sound of a young girl crying completely shattered Detective David Miller's professional composure. The terrifying reality of the situation crashed over him like a physical wave. The secondary vault was perfectly airtight. Emma had been locked inside that small, unventilated steel box since Robert first heard the utility crew strike the pipe hours ago. The oxygen inside the tiny room was rapidly depleting. Every single second that passed was bringing an innocent 11-year-old girl closer to suffocation. Miller did not wait for the specialized commercial safecracking team. They were at least an hour away, and Emma absolutely did not have an hour left. Miller spun around, sprinting back across the lavender room. He climbed the rusted iron staircase faster than he ever had in his entire career, his boots clanging violently against the metal grating. He pulled himself up through the hole in the basement floor, sprinted up the wooden stairs, and burst through the splintered front door of the colonial house. He ran across the frosty front lawn, rushing directly toward the locked police cruiser parked in the driveway. He yanked the heavy metal door open, grabbing Robert violently by the collar of his shirt and pulling him forward against the seatbelt. Robert looked at the furious detective, his eyes completely cold and defiant. He was fully prepared to remain silent, believing he had built a fortress that the police could never penetrate. "What is the combination?" Miller roared, his voice tearing with raw, unyielding desperation. "Give me the numbers right now, Robert." Robert simply turned his head away, staring out the window at his pristine front lawn, refusing to speak a single word. Miller tightened his grip on Robert's collar, pulling the man's face just inches away from his own. He knew he had to completely shatter the twisted, delusional psychological narrative that Robert had built for himself. Robert didn't view himself as a kidnapper. In his sick, controlling mind, he believed he was a perfect father, a protector keeping his daughter entirely safe from a chaotic world and a broken marriage. "Listen to me very carefully," Miller whispered, his voice trembling with a dark, heavy intensity. "That vault is completely airtight. The oxygen is almost gone. She is down there right now, crying in the pitch-black dark, suffocating to death because of you. If you don't give me that code right now, she is going to die in that box. And if she dies, you aren't her protector. You aren't a good father keeping her safe. You are just a pathetic murderer who choked his own little girl to death in the dark." The heavy, devastating reality of Miller's words struck Robert like a physical blow to the chest. The deeply arrogant, flawless mask of absolute control finally, completely shattered. Robert's eyes widened in sudden, blinding panic. The cognitive dissonance protecting his ego collapsed as he realized his flawless architectural plan was actually killing the only thing he cared about. His breathing turned rapid and shallow. He looked at Miller, his face completely pale, and his voice cracked into a desperate, pathetic whisper. 42, Robert stammered, his entire body trembling. 17, 35, turn the dial left to right. Miller didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. He dropped Robert, slammed the cruiser door shut, and sprinted back into the house. He threw himself down the basement stairs, nearly falling through the hole in the floor as he rushed back into the lavender underground room. The tactical officers backed away, lowering their weapons as Miller stepped directly up to the heavy steel vault door hidden behind the wardrobe. Miller grabbed the cold steel dial. His hands were shaking violently, but he forced himself to focus, remembering the exact sequence. He spun the heavy dial to the left, stopping perfectly on 42. He carefully spun it back to the right, feeling the heavy internal tumblers click into place, stopping on 17. He turned it back to the left one final time, stopping precisely on 35. Miller grabbed the heavy steel handle attached to the door and pulled backward with absolutely every ounce of his physical strength. A loud, deep, metallic clack echoed through the underground room as the heavy locking pins retracted. The massive steel door groaned, resisting for a second before finally swinging open. A loud, sharp hiss filled the air as the airtight seal was violently broken, fresh oxygen rushing immediately into the dark, incredibly confined space. Miller shined his tactical flashlight into the tiny, windowless steel box. Huddled completely in the farthest corner of the freezing vault, sitting on the bare metal floor with her knees pulled tightly to her chest, was Emma. She was incredibly pale, her small frame shivering violently in the cold. She was wearing a faded pink sweater that was slightly too small for her. She raised her trembling hands, shielding her highly sensitive eyes from the blinding glare of the police flashlights. She was completely terrified, gasping for breath, the thin air in the vault having nearly caused her to lose consciousness. Miller immediately dropped his flashlight. He took off his heavy police jacket, knelt down on the cold steel floor, and gently wrapped the warm jacket around her small, trembling shoulders. He took off his police hat, making sure his face was completely visible, and spoke in the softest, most gentle voice he could possibly manage. "Emma," Miller whispered, heavy tears completely flooding his eyes. "My name is David. I am a police officer. You are entirely safe now. Nobody is ever going to lock you in the dark again. We are here to take you home." Emma lowered her hand slowly, blinking rapidly as her eyes adjusted to the light. She looked at the men in uniform, her bright blue eyes wide with confusion and fear. She had been told by her father for 6 years that the outside world was incredibly dangerous, that terrible people were always looking for her, and that the underground room was the only safe place left on Earth. But as she looked at Detective Miller's kind, weeping eyes, the deep, primal instinct of a child recognized that she was finally being rescued. Emma let out a quiet, heartbreaking sob. She reached forward, wrapping her small, fragile arms tightly around Detective Miller's neck. Miller gently picked her up, holding her securely against his chest. He carried her out of the steel vault, walking slowly across the lavender room. He carried her up the rusted iron staircase, moving past the shattered concrete floor of the basement, and finally walked up the wooden stairs into the living room. When Miller carried Emma out the broken front door and stepped onto the front porch, the bright, crisp afternoon sun washed completely over them. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face into Miller's shoulder. It was the very first time she had felt the warmth of the sun or breathed fresh, natural air in 6 agonizing years. The tactical medics immediately rushed forward, gently taking Emma from the detective and placing her onto a warm, heated stretcher. They loaded her carefully into the back of an ambulance, treating her for severe oxygen deprivation and shock, and drove her immediately toward the county hospital. While the ambulance raced through the streets of Doylestown, a young police officer was dispatched directly to the hospital where Sophia worked. The officer found Sophia sitting at the main nurse's station, writing notes on a patient chart. The officer walked up to the counter, took off his hat, and softly told her that she needed to come with him immediately. When Sophia asked what had happened, the young officer simply smiled, his own eyes welling with tears. "We found her," he whispered. "She is alive." Sophia dropped her pen. Her knees instantly buckled, completely giving out beneath her. 2 of her fellow nurses rushed forward, catching her as she let out a loud, breathless sob of absolute, world-altering shock. The 6 years of agonizing, torturous waiting, the thousands of sleepless nights, the unbearable weight of an empty home, it all culminated in a single, impossible miracle. Sophia was rushed down the hospital corridors to the secure pediatric recovery wing. The floor was entirely locked down, heavily guarded by police officers to protect the survivor. Sophia stopped in front of the heavy wooden door of the private room. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely turn the brass handle. She took a deep, trembling breath, slowly pushing the door open. The hospital room was kept very dim to protect Emma's sensitive eyes. Emma was sitting up in the hospital bed, hooked up to intravenous fluids, wrapped tightly in warm white blankets. When the door opened, Emma slowly turned her head. Sophia completely froze in the doorway, the breath leaving her lungs in a heavy, agonizing rush. The visual dissonance was incredibly profound. Sophia had spent the last 6 years mourning a tiny, 5-year-old girl with a missing front tooth. The person sitting in the hospital bed was a quiet, fragile 11-year-old young woman. The blonde curls had grown long and straight. Her face had matured, losing its baby roundness. But as Sophia looked deeply into those bright blue eyes, she saw her little girl. "Emma," Sophia choked out, her voice a desperate, cracking whisper. Emma stared at the woman standing in the doorway. Robert had spent 6 years systematically trying to erase Sophia from Emma's memory, telling the little girl that her mother had left them, that she had moved far away, and that she didn't want to see them anymore. But the bond between a mother and a child is forged in a place far deeper than spoken lies. Emma remembered the smell of her mother. She remembered the gentle voice reading her stories about brave princesses. Emma's lower lip began to tremble violently. Heavy tears spilled completely over her pale cheeks. She reached her thin, trembling hand out from beneath the heavy white blankets. "Mommy," Emma whispered, her voice incredibly weak and fragile, "you found me." Sophia let out a loud, raw, agonizing cry of pure relief. She ran to the side of the hospital bed, throwing her arms around her daughter, burying her face into Emma's shoulder. Emma wrapped her thin arms around her mother's neck, holding on with a desperate, fierce intensity. They wept openly, lost in a massive ocean of profound, indescribable grief and joy. The years of forced separation, the lies, and the dark concrete walls completely melted away in the warmth of that beautiful, unbreakable embrace. In the weeks and months that followed the rescue, the complete, horrifying truth of the 1995 disappearance was finally laid bare for the entire world to see. Robert's meticulously planned fortress of deception entirely collapsed. The district attorney presented the grand jury with a mountain of absolute, irrefutable physical evidence. They brought the forged architectural blueprints into the courtroom. They played detailed, horrifying video recordings showing the completely hidden subterranean vault, the fake ventilation pipe, and the deeply disturbing tally marks drawn on the acoustic foam walls. The psychological profile of the crime was completely exposed. Robert was not a grieving father. He was a deeply narcissistic, highly controlling predator who could not tolerate the idea of losing control over his family during a separation. Instead of sharing custody, he chose to completely fake a kidnapping, locking his daughter in a permanent underground prison so he could possess her entirely, manipulating the police and torturing his ex-wife in the process. Faced with the undeniable physical evidence and the powerful, devastating testimony of his surviving daughter, Robert's legal defense completely disintegrated. To avoid a highly publicized trial, he signed a full confession, pleading guilty to aggravated kidnapping, child endangerment, and false imprisonment. The judge showed absolutely no mercy. Robert was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the absolute possibility of parole. He was heavily shackled, stripped of his expensive suits, and transferred to a maximum security state penitentiary. The man who had spent his entire life building dark, windowless cages to control others was permanently locked inside a small, concrete cell, completely stripped of all power, destined to die alone in the dark. Following the trial, the city of Doylestown condemned the beautiful, two-story colonial house. A massive demolition crew arrived on a bright summer morning, using heavy machinery to completely bulldoze the structure into the ground. They tore up the foundation, filled the hidden concrete vault with tons of solid gravel and earth, and completely erased Robert's twisted architectural nightmare from the map. The lot was left as an empty, grassy field, allowing the sun to finally shine directly onto the earth where so much darkness had been hidden. The recovery process for Emma was an incredibly slow, delicate, and deeply beautiful journey. Re-entering a world that she hadn't seen since she was 5 years old was a massive, overwhelming shock. She had to learn how to interact with other children, how to walk in the bright sunlight without shielding her eyes, and how to trust that the doors in her home would never be locked from the outside. But she was never asked to walk that difficult path alone for a single second. Sophia was right by her side, guiding her with endless patience and fiercely protecting her peace. They moved to a beautiful, bright apartment near the ocean, far away from the quiet streets of Pennsylvania. Sophia adjusted her nursing schedule to ensure she was always home when Emma woke up and always there when she went asleep. Emma was enrolled in highly specialized psychological therapy, slowly unpacking the years of isolation and lies her father had forced upon her. With time, the pale, fragile girl who had been pulled from the steel vault began to slowly blossom. She learned how to laugh again. She learned how to run in the grass. And slowly she began to draw again, filling her sketchbooks not with dark walls and shadows, but with bright, vibrant landscapes and wide-open skies. On a warm, beautiful Sunday morning exactly 2 years after she was rescued, Emma and Sophia were walking together along the sandy beach near their new home. The bright sun was shining warmly overhead, reflecting beautifully off the crashing ocean waves. Emma, now 13 years old, was walking slightly ahead of her mother, the ocean breeze blowing her blonde hair across her smiling face. She stopped near the edge of the water, bending down to pick up a smooth, perfectly white seashell. She turned around and ran back to Sophia, placing the shell gently into her mother's hand. Sophia looked at the beautiful shell, and then she looked up at her brave, incredible daughter. She smiled, feeling a massive, overwhelming sense of profound gratitude wash completely over her. The nightmare was entirely, permanently over. The story of the 5-year-old girl who was taken in the middle of the night, hidden directly beneath her own house for 6 long years, became a legendary case study in the history of American law enforcement. It stood as a dark, chilling reminder that absolute evil does not always break through a window from the outside. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones who hold the keys to the front door, using the quiet isolation of a pristine neighborhood to mask their cruelty. But far more importantly, it remains an immortal, unbreakable testament to the enduring nature of truth and the absolute resilience of the human spirit. A monster can forge a blueprint. He can pour tons of solid concrete. He can build a steel vault deep beneath the earth, and he can manipulate the world into looking the wrong way for years. He can believe he has permanently silenced the light. But the truth is a patient, living thing. It waits in the rusted iron of a hidden pipe. It survives the deepest isolation, and eventually it always finds a way to break through the stone. Time has a way of shattering even the heaviest concrete walls, proving that no matter how deep you bury a secret, and no matter how many years pass, the light will always find a way to cut through the dark, completely destroying the silence and finally bringing the lost ones home.